Hello, hello. Welcome to the Takedown, Subverting Power or Radical Thought. I'm your host, Nick Nowlin, and today we have a special guest with us, Benjamin Studebaker. I don't know if you guys have been kind of following the show, but, I've had him on before and we had a great conversation. And so now here we are, post-election, to basically go back and kind of rehash some of our discussion. Ben, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience and kind of tell them about yourself and where you can be found and things of that nature.
Yeah, I'm a PhD student at Cambridge, going into my third year. Work on democracy and inequality, mostly in rich countries like the US and UK. And you can follow my blog at benjaminstudebaker.com, Studebaker spelled like the car. And it's great to be back.
All right. So it's very interesting that, before, let's kind of go back and kind of like, I don't know. I should have told you basically this is going to be kind of like an ambush almost, because I should have told you to go back and review that video that we made and kind of remember kind of some of our arguments there, because I'm going to be pulling heavily from that video for this discussion. But I'm pretty sure, like, your opinions on it, I'm sure they're going to be about the same, or maybe they've changed post-Trump. So remember, we talked about kind of like politicians and what they have to do. And I remember one of our biggest arguments or point of contention between you and I was like, I see the politician as being an enabler or like the body of, a person that has the ability to change the political landscape in some way, shape, or form. And you were arguing, particularly when you're talking about being anti-imperialist, you were saying that perhaps that's not the way to go. Perhaps a way to go would be more to meld into what the current orthodoxy is. What do you feel about that now?
Well, I didn't say that they should meld into the current orthodoxy, but that their way in which they critique it should be a little bit milder than some of the most fervent anti-imperialism. So I argued that someone like Jeremy Corbyn can say that it's a mistake to stage interventions in places like Syria or Iraq, but that he tends to get into political trouble if he claims that the people who are for those interventions are malicious actors who are deliberately trying to create problems. People have an easier time believing that Bushes and Blairs have made mistakes than that they are deeply villainous people. In this particular race, I think that Corbyn benefited a lot from the fact that international relations was not really central and didn't get a whole lot of play in the campaign. He benefited from two core things, I think. The first being that he was able to attract both a lot of Remainer votes from Remainers who believed that a Labour Party Brexit would be milder than a Conservative Party Brexit, and then from Leave voters who believe in the welfare state, believe in strong public services, and are against the cuts that the Conservatives have made and that they were promising to continue to make. On top of that, with young people and with the student debt burden in the UK that has become so vast, £100 billion now in total outstanding student debt. And Corbyn promised to get rid of tuition fees starting the very next year. And he insinuated that a Labour government might do something about that debt burden, which many people read as, oh, Corbyn is going to cancel our student debt, which for people well up into their 30s was a major thing. And that gave him a huge vote boost among everybody under 40.
Okay. So what you did there, I was talking about generally, but now, you add the context of a political election. There's some different forces that come into play here. So just as you sort of articulated there, like people's interests weren't necessarily on foreign relations, and just having a good domestic policy was able to overcome kind of any type of skepticism or criticisms that you probably could fall victim to just by having a good domestic policy. What I'm saying is that you can use that very same phenomena to actually change foreign policy and make current ideas that may not be popular now to bring them into the forefront as real policy, just by nature of having a good domestic policy and nobody caring about what the foreign policy is. I'm saying there's an argument to be made that perhaps, having a strong message against such things, or showing people as malicious actors, maybe not as malicious actors, as maybe uncaring, unkind, and truly disastrous actors. Maybe, laying that critique down, whether it's popular or not, won't matter as much because it's not going to cost you much. But in the long run, and if you're looking at like a movement as a whole, it could be very beneficial just by having the idea out there.
I think that Corbyn would, if he got into government, he would have an opportunity to do some things differently in foreign policy. But whether he would most easily be able to politically do those things by using very anti-imperialist language, or if he would benefit from framing it in a less directly hostile way, I think is something that would still be open for debate. And I think on foreign policy, it's very important that Brexit has become the only foreign policy issue that anybody really cares about. And everything else has just been completely pushed outside of the political discussion. Nobody's talking anymore about ISIS in Britain. And there were terrorist attacks before the election, and they made no serious impact on the foreign policy discussion. Indeed, the way that the terrorist attacks impacted the political debate was to shift the focus to Tory police cuts. And Corbyn and the Labour Party ended up arguing that the police budget should be dramatically increased, and that they turned that into a bit of a vote winner, or at least not a vote loser for Labour.
And that's actually kind of interesting. But I think my case was, that being that as it may, most people are going to focus on their domestic policy. And as such, you can have an unpopular foreign relations policy and it's not going to hurt you. It's really not going to hurt you very much, depending on what the situation is. It's obviously unique to every individual country and whatever the context that you're working in. But I think in particular, like, people need to understand that, like, I think the view that you have to kind of slow walk it is a little bit misguided.
Well, I think that the context matters insofar as the issues that become the most important. You need to have something to say to people that is a strong winning thing on those issues. And if you have issues where you have less popular positions, you can get away with that as long as those issues aren't at the top of the agenda. Like you said, as long as they're not the thing that everyone's paying attention to. But if everyone were paying attention to foreign policy, and then you give a foreign policy view which is really unpopular, in an election campaign, that's a lot to deal with when you're trying to win seats, and where a percentage point or two could make a big difference to the final vote count in a first past the post system.
What would you say about popularity, though? Because at a certain point, though, I think Chomsky does his best. He talks about manufacturing consent, and he talks about thought leaders. Like, when you're a highly public figure, you occupy a space as a thought leader, and your ideas. So if you argue them correctly, you kind of bring people over to your side, and they will tell their friends, or other people will listen to you. And just by nature of the idea being out there for a long enough time, it sort of gets the credibility, regardless of if it's being seen in a negative light. And I think there's tons of empirical examples for this. One example would be supply side economics. When it first came out, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't say first came out, when it had its first resurgence earlier in the 20th century, it was laughed at and people mocked it and everybody made fun of it. But all it did was stay around for long enough and be out there for long enough. And of course, get, powerful interests backing it in institutions. And it became validated. And now it's the reigning orthodoxy of the day. So I think that, just because something is unpopular doesn't mean it doesn't need to be out there. And I don't think that when you're waging a campaign basing upon, let me finish it out. I'll say, I don't think when you're trying to win a campaign in one election versus trying to change or move the electorate along, those are different types of things that you can work about. I think in particular with Corbyn, his goal wasn't to win election in one go. His goal is to change the electorate so that he's changing it to such an extent that winning election after that for his ideas and his party, those things will be more easy to accomplish because he's changed how the narrative is and how the politics of the region is.
I agree with that. And I definitely agree that Corbyn, especially as positioned as opposed to Schmidt in the Labour leadership contest from the other year, positioned himself as someone who wanted to move the voters in Labor's direction rather than move Labor to where the voters were. And I think that's certainly a strategy you can have, and it can be successful. But where I would kind of disagree is that I think that certain kinds of conditions open the door on certain issues, and they open the door to different kinds and levels of change. So, for instance, in the case of supply-side economics, I think that supply-side economics would have remained a fringe position if it were not for the stagflation that happened in the 70s. The stagflation in the 70s offered a problem that supply-side economics could be used to solve, or spoken of as if it could be used to solve. And that was very powerful in making this idea, which seemed fringe, more acceptable. But I think after the Iraq War, we reached a historical moment where it was possible to say that interventions are not smart, and to make a really compelling argument that they are a mistake and that a lot of the operating assumptions underneath them are really questionable. But then that further moved to say, oh, and the people who supported those interventions are accessories to a world system that is fundamentally evil. I don't think that people were ready for that move. And post 2008, we've seen since then an opening on economic policy where people have been willing to think about alternative ways of running economies because they don't feel that the way the economy is operating is working for them. So again, we have, like in the 70s, this problem that people are looking for solutions for, and the left can offer a solution that's really compelling in that context. But with anti-imperialism, we have a solution that is not chasing something that many people in the rich Western countries recognize as a problem. And in part, that's because of how imperialism works. Imperialism tends to benefit people, or at least appear to benefit people, in the rich Western countries. So it's going to be harder until they see that it's hurting them for them to take a view that they should be against imperialism in this broader sense. We have an opportunity to chip away at the arguments for certain kinds of interventions and nation-building activities. But we should not see that as necessarily meaning that people are ready to go all the way in whole hog on the whole thing.
Well, all the way in the whole hog is generalized language. Let's be specific. Perhaps things like recognizing that NATO is not a peace force, but more like a geostrategic force that's used to X, Y, and Z.
NATO withdrawal has always been one of the issues where, when you poll British people on that, it's about a 75-25 in favor of staying in NATO. And people get their backs really up if they think that a major party candidate plans to take Britain out of NATO.
Well, perhaps maybe not leaving NATO, but just recognizing what the organization is and and recognizing that perhaps it does need to change, or our relationship with it needs to change. Maybe you moderate your language there, but the goal remains the same. Maybe your tactic changes, but the goal should remain the same. I think I want to get back to
more specific. So what should then the approach be to NATO? What would the moderation be?
Well, the moderation would be identifying its structural problems, whatever they may be. This NATO did X, Y, and Z, use historical examples and say this is an example of NATO doing something it really shouldn't be doing. We need to have more oversight over what we're going on or what we're participating in because it's dominated by the U.S.
Historical examples. And if the historical examples had been a sufficient problem in enough people's minds, then when those historical events had happened, we would have seen a lot of people saying, I
disagree with that. And the reason why I disagree with that is because the history is shrouded. The history is not well known.
In the early 80s, everyone was talking about NATO in Britain, and there was big interest about the role of NATO. And again, a Labour Party candidate said that he was willing to consider taking Britain out of NATO, and it really hamstrung their campaign in the early 80s and caused a lot of Labour supporters to split off and support the SDP coalition.
Well, again, I didn't say maybe you should split off. I think the idea first would be to get everybody to recognize the bad that NATO does do and say we need to figure out a way to moderate these things. And then in that fight, understand that, hey, maybe the institution is not worth saving or X, Y, and Z, but it's a process because you tried to take them out of NATO without first explaining to them how bad NATO is or giving real examples that would resonate with people with facts. And you could say that they were talking about it, but I'll be honest with you. In the 80s, criticism, you know what? I wasn't alive back then. But when I did, just cursory research about discussion of NATO in the 80s, it was still very one-sided.
Oh, of course it was one-sided, and that's part of why it didn't work out. But nowadays, it's, if anything, more one-sided than it was in the 80s. In the 80s, there were significant parts of the left that were still quite active, that were very anti-imperialist. Colonialism had, in many countries, had only just recently gained independence, and there was a lot more vocalized upset in the 70s and early 80s, and a lot of left-wing political action groups that were really excited about what they had the potential to do. And it didn't really work out. And so I think that we have to try to learn from cases in which left-wing politics doesn't pan out the way that people at that time expected.
So the question is, now we're talking about, to me, it almost seems as though we're speaking like about giving up something. Like, okay, maybe the electorate is not ready for that, so we have to put that to the side. But when you do that, depending on we're gonna try to. There's a lot of moving parts in this, people, and we're all arguing as if everything is staying fixed. But what I'm saying is, perhaps even if you lost, you can stay where you are, and even by nature of staying where you are, and by nature of how politics works, it'll swing back your way, one way or the other, as another issue becomes more to light, and because you've been there, saying the same position consistently. For year after year after year, election after election after election, people are used to the message, and they'll be willing to accept it, or they won't be.
Well, you might find that you're in a situation where, if you had bent a little bit on one issue, you might find that there's some other issue that people at that point in time became really ready for something different on. And because you didn't bend on that one issue, you missed this other opportunity to do something really transformative. Like what I was saying before about how since 2008, we have this opportunity to really change the way that people think about economics and talk about stuff that would not have been politically feasible in the mid-2000s. If we hold other issues as priorities in such a way that we aren't able to produce political platforms that take advantage of these economic moments, then that will facilitate economic centrists in their bids to maintain control over mainstream left-wing parties.
I don't think so, and here's why.
I
was going to say, I don't think so, and here's why. Because the economic centrists will not be able to actually change or modify the system beyond what's causing the crisis to begin with. They will never be able to offer a true alternative. What they'll offer is a lighter version of the same, and that will never alleviate the situation. So the opportunity the problem will fester, and the opportunity will come back your way.
But there's another fight going on at the same time. We're not just in a fight between the centrists and the left. We're in a fight between the left, the centrists, and the right nationalists. And what will happen is if we're in a situation where the left is more disorganized and more divided than the right, then that creates opportunities for the right to come in and win.
And here's the problem with that logic, though, because the centrists are the right. They're all the right. Maybe they have a variation here and there, but they are the right. And the problem is when you have the right and you ally with them against the right, you're empowering the right ultimately.
Well, see, but here again, we're conflating a set of different issues together that are a little bit distinctive. So we're in a situation where there's an opportunity to take over left-wing parties on economic issues. Left-wing as in what is generally referred to as left-wing.
What do you mean by that? Let's put a definition on that, because ultimately, there's some things that are non-negotiable.
There would not have been a left-wing party in a progressive sense, and the Labor Party under Bill Clinton would not have been a left-wing party in a progressive sense. But there has been an opportunity since 2008 to, on economic issues, make those parties more left-wing, or at least produce a serious challenge and a serious debate that might help independent organizations. So, for instance, even though Bernie Sanders didn't win and didn't succeed in taking over the Democratic Party, he drew a lot of attention to left-wing economic issues. And if that doesn't help the left take over the Democratic Party in the future, it might help other organizations get going. and it might inspire other people to join other organizations.
So wait. Let's place that in the context of United States politics, because that will be easier for me to talk about, and it would probably be best for our audience, because even I got trapped into the idea that the left is the right, and I'm thinking in the U.S. I'm thinking very U.S. centric, or so it'd be best for us to focus on the U.S. because when we use like world examples, it's a lot different.
Yeah, I can
in the UK, you have mechanisms in place where other parties actually can come out and just randomly win, and there's a lot of stuff that didn't happen here. And here we have, a strong two-party system, and just by nature of crisis, I think you can use that two-party system to your benefit, just as the right has done to theirs.
Right. And so there might be a little bit more opportunity to do party capture.
But what's interesting,
you have a primary challenger that is galvanizing, and even if he loses, you can produce a lot of energy that might go into other movements. Some of these other socialists.
And look, I don't disagree with that. The United States, as far as activism is concerned and advocacy and things of that nature, doesn't really fall behind anyone per se. We just don't have a strong labor movement here. But I do think, as far as understanding what effective is and understanding what a victory is, I think we're largely confused. And I think that that's something that we don't share, because we don't have something like a strong labor union that can pull, the different parts together, because most people share that commonality in that they work. And that's really like hamstrung us as far as, really bringing about change. But let's speak about, Bernie Sanders, so to speak. And you were saying like what he has done. And I will tell you that, so far, tallying up all of what he's done, it's barely breaking even right now. Like when you think about the detrimental things he's done, and you take the positive things, right now he's barely breaking even. And if he continues on this path, I'm pretty sure by midterms he'll be negative.
Well, I would put it this way: if you have an opportunity to move a major left-wing party, or to generate a lot of enthusiasm for alternative left-wing movements on a set of issues, but if you prioritize a different set of issues, you'll negate a lot of that energy, then we can be in a situation where it's not about, we're completely going along with what the center wants versus we're completely sticking with the left. And I think sometimes in our conversations, you've tended to read me as saying, we have to give up on being left-wing and support the center, which is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there are certain issues that we could really move things left on. But there are certain issues that are not connected to the historical moment in the same way. And so sometimes putting these different issues in the same basket, when from a historical point of view, they're in a little bit different baskets that are moving along the track at different speeds.
Okay. And look, I understand that. I'm not saying, you try to go and you give up on what you can do and all that. But what I'm saying is, how do you decide, what can be done and what should be done? And then on top of that, implicit in your analysis here is a short-term, strategy. Like, it's mostly focused on the next election. It's not really, it doesn't seem to me like a long-term strategy.
Well, we need kind of a two-level thing going, because there will be historical crisis moments. And we had that in 2008 and in the years that have followed, this historical crisis moment that opened up a certain set of possible changes, or at least that we believe opened up a certain set of possible changes. And if because we take this long-term view, miss a crisis moment that enables that set of changes, then we might get passed by. And someone else might take advantage of that crisis moment and implement a different set of changes. So I'm not saying, we should stick with the center, because of course the center doesn't respond to the crisis at all. The center sits there and does nothing. But if we pass up this crisis moment and the right does not, and the right seizes that moment, then we'll still be left in the same situation we were in before the crisis, where it's just the center and the even further right.
What I'm foreseeing is, without providing a real alternative on the left that's different from both the centrists and the right, I don't think you're in a different position at all. If you win by catering to the centrists, You're not in a better position if the right one and you didn't cater to
the on certain issues. So, like for instance, if we have a platform that says, single payer universal health care, we have a platform that says universal free college education, we have a platform that says some kind of high universal basic income, whatever the set of economic reforms may be, and we can and should argue over what precisely they should be. If we have that, and it is really different from what the center is doing, that's a powerful thing. Now, let's say we have all of that. We have a genuinely left-wing economic platform that is attractive to people. If adding on top of that anti-imperialism would cause that package to fail politically, then that would be a really regrettable loss.
Wait.
If something else we could add on top, something maybe that's a little bit more diluted, but still takes into account a lot of the important things that anti-imperialists are saying, then we still get the rest of what we're trying to do. And that stuff isn't centrist stuff. It's quite left-wing stuff.
So, well, I would argue that UBI is a very centrist thing, but regardless.
And the level that you do it at. A very high UBI would be quite left-wing. A very low UBI would be quite right-wing.
Explain. Well, you know what? We don't want to get sidetracked. The point here is what I'm saying is you're right. Let's say you had something like anti-imperialism, or you had like a genuine beginning of a peace movement, and it wasn't quite ready yet, and it caused that agenda to fail because not enough people were attracted to it. So long as the problems exist
at a fixed window, and so if you miss the window,
the fixed window is tied to the problems. The material conditions are the window. You don't lose a window until the material conditions are gone.
For instance, think about the 70s and what ended up happening in the 70s. In the 70s, people became convinced that supply-side economics had solved the crisis of the 70s, even though it isn't what did that. And so supply-side economics was deified for a full generation because people believed that it solved the crisis of the 70s. And so there's a danger if you allow someone else to take advantage of the crisis, that something else will happen that causes the crisis to moderate a little bit. And then everyone thinks, oh, this is what fixed it. We have mourning in America. And then you end up losing 20, 30 years.
Yeah. Well, it all depends, because this mourning in America, that mourning in America, led us to where we are today, where it was good for a little bit. And now we're right back where we started, if not a lot worse off.
Yeah,
so now
another window, but then think about all of the suffering that's happened in the meantime that you could have prevented if you'd taken better advantage of the previous window.
Well, I think it's hard to say that stagflation was necessarily started wholly by the right. I think the left owes some responsibility to Jimmy Carter in installing Mr. Volcker.
I would not say that Jimmy Carter was really left-wing in an economic sense in the 70s.
Well, we're using left and right kind of loosely here, people. And you know what? We're kind of shifting it around a little bit. But yes, Jimmy Carter would be considered left today. But back then, he was a very conservative force used to squash the left even back then. But this is what I'm talking about. You unified with somebody, a centrist, and that centrist was used to crush the left. And then he gave the right an opportunity.
See, there you had someone who was not committed to left-wing economic policy. You had someone who was willing to do deregulation and who was willing to put Paul Volcker in charge of the Fed. So there you had someone who wasn't offering you anything. You weren't getting any goodies out of supporting them. Someone like Bernie Sanders, you would get a certain set of goodies. You would get, if he got congressional support, and all
depending on if he had the will to fight for those things. And lately, his actions just have shown me that he doesn't have the will to fight for very much.
Well, say for instance that you have, like for instance with Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson had a lot of limitations on foreign policy. Lyndon Johnson was real big on escalating Vietnam, and pretty much every decision he made with respect to Vietnam was a terrible, terrible mistake. At the same time, Lyndon Johnson was powerfully effective in improving civil rights in the country, in creating Medicare, in creating a whole host of poverty relief programs. That administration was deeply, deeply flawed. But if we had been unwilling to support Johnson because of Vietnam, and we then caused a Republican to be elected, or a Democrat who was much less committed to the Great Society agenda, that would have been a big loss for poor and working people. And that's what happened in 1968 when the left decided to protest the Democratic National Convention because Humphrey was picked as the nominee. Humphrey, who was considered quite left-wing by the Democratic Party standards of that time on domestic issues, but who was a full supporter of the Vietnam War. And so we ended up splitting the left in the late 60s over the Vietnam issue in a way that killed us going forward, because then Nixon takes over the country. And then Nixon makes foreign policy decisions that lead to the OPEC embargo in 73, and that produces stagflation. And then before you know it, we've got Reagan and Carter and Volcker and all of that.
Well, wait a minute. Let me go back in there, though.
What's going to happen?
Let's rewind a little bit and add a little bit of context to what you just said, because do you have an echo? Where's that echo coming from?
Could be a volume thing or something. I don't think I have an echo on it.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, I was going to say this. We have to add some context, because while that chain of events is accurate, there's some context missing there. We have to remember that, the unions were largely powerful during that time. That was like the last little hurrah of the union movement. And, part of their decay happened because they were largely conservative, racist organizations, that kind of went full board behind the war. So that's kind of where you have the economic faction kind of splitting off and going full bore behind the war, whereas other factions in the left, were kind of trying to move away from the war. So, right. but I don't think there was a way to moderate that split. I think by nature of where they were, largely affluent, suburbanite conservative figures, they probably should have never been on the left to begin with in the coalition. And that led to that really opened the gates for their own demise, because after they did that, after they betrayed the left on that war issue, they were destroyed.
Well, you see, I think it's interesting because you say that they're the conservatives. The conservatives are the ones who supported the war. But I think that there's an argument to be made that what was quite conservative was to put the war ahead of an agenda that helped poor people in the country. And people who refused to support Humphrey, who was a Great Society 60s liberal, not what we've got today, on the basis of the war, ended up giving Richard Nixon the presidency.
Well, implicit in that argument is that, again, you're supposed to give up on that and not make that a central priority. And I think that the problem is we're not taking into account the feedback that comes from those wars. You might say, I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's possible to split them up and say, well, we should have just not did that and just let the war roll on, because who knows what could have been done with the war culture that would have come back and bite the left in the back behind later on.
There's no opportunity to stop the war in 68.
Well, again,
he did continue the war.
Part of politics, though, and this has been my argument, and I think we've always disagreed on this, but part of politics is not just taking what's possible at the moment. Part of it is making what is possible in the moment.
See, yeah, I think this is one of our core differences, is a kind of agency thing, where I think you tend to see politicians as agents who act on the context. And I tend to see politicians as figures produced by the context and empowered by the context only insofar as the context allows.
So I agree with that, but they can be both. They can be both actors, and they can also be fed back and produced. It all depends on the strength and what's behind that particular politician. It's
kind of a basic thing. Do you think that people are produced by conditions, or do you think that people shape conditions?
I think they do both.
Conditions, but it's kind of difficult for them to do both, because if people are produced by conditions, then what the shaping that they do will have itself been determined by the conditions that shape those people.
Yeah, but it's not a chicken before the egg kind of thing, because people are shaped by their conditions. I will not deny that. But there's times, but under that logic, it's just like, well, how does change come about? If everybody's under the same conditions, how do you change from the current orthodoxy if everybody's within it? Somebody has to do it outside of the orthodoxy somewhere.
Well, so in political theory, we have this kind of split between what we call idealists and materialists. And materialists tend to believe that it's the changes in the distribution of power and in the distribution of wealth and in the distribution of opportunity that create further changes. And idealists think that it's something that predominantly happens through argument and through discussion and through people interacting with each other and making choices, through deliberation. And so if you think that materialism is what drives change, then you think that it's the set of economic conditions, it's the set of foreign policy conditions that produce reactions in people that contribute to change. And if you think that idealism is what's doing it, then you think that you can have a charismatic leader who changes people's minds even if conditions are held constant.
Well, see, I don't wholly subscribe to either. I do believe that the ideal and the material kind of mesh. Like, so when you're thinking about it, like a person gets an idea, a material condition is unsuitable. So they have an idea of what they want change to be, and they articulate that idea. Other people see the vision or agree with that vision, or for whatever reason, or they're suffering the same thing, and so that they want to make that idea a new material condition. They want to bring that into the physical realm, and so they go to actualize that in some way.
Right there, you start with the material condition. So there, you're saying, okay, we identify this economic problem. Let's say people our living standards are stagnating, there's high unemployment, whatever it might be. People react to that by having new ideas about how they could change that situation and solve that problem. And then because other people are suffering from the same condition, they hear that idea and they find it appealing. If they weren't suffering from that condition, then when they heard that idea, they'd go, why do we need this? And many Hillary Clinton supporters who are more materially comfortable would hear left-wing ideas about changing the economy and they'd go, well, why do we really need this?
But there's also space there for the idealist theory too as well, though, because there could be someone who has charisma that can draw people in, or there could be an idea that's attractive enough that would draw people in, that even though they may not have the material conditions to want that change per se, they can just not be adverse to it because it doesn't sound bad or things of that nature. There's more to it than that.
What I think is if you have a condition, there has to be some level of conditional favorability for an idea. And if that idea doesn't have the conditional favorability, it doesn't matter how you talk about it, nothing will change. That's something I do believe. There has to be a certain level of conditional favorability. So when I talk about these windows, I'm kind of talking about these periods of conditional favorability where people are open to change. And so with something like anti-imperialism, to have that really catch on, we would need the people who are making the decisions about whether to be anti-imperialists be themselves very negatively affected by anti-imperialism in a way that's clear that you can illustrate. And the problem with that, and this has always been the problem for anti-imperialism, is that generally middle-class and working-class people in Western countries benefit from imperialism to various degrees. And so it's very hard to show them how they suffer from it in a way that they're likely to find convincing. And because of that, you don't have a certain set of conditions that you would need to really make lots and lots of people be fervent anti-imperialists.
And so the problem I have with that is I would argue that no, we don't benefit. The benefits from it are hard to see, directly by looking at it. And also the negatives from it are actually hard to see as well. Like there's many things that, that we suffer from now that we probably wouldn't suffer from if we had the ability to rein in imperialism and state control over individuals, period. Like when we look at like how we've lost all our privacy law rights, we've lost basically the Magna Carta, look at the police, killing people with impunity. These are all things that happen when you're in a very severe police state, which occurs generally when you have rampant, uncontrolled state power, particularly in terms of violence. And that comes from having, it comes from a state of rampant imperialism in a way. Those things abroad come home.
Right. Well, like I said when I was talking about interventionist wars, there are components of the anti-imperialist agenda that people are willing to problematize, but they aren't willing to problematize them along with these other things that at least seem to benefit them. Like, for instance, one of the benefits of imperialism to people living in the West is that they get a lot of cheap consumer goods because we run wages down in developing countries, and we put people to work in sweatshops, and we outsource the oppression of capitalism to poor and developing countries. And because of that, you can walk into a Walmart and you can buy really cheap T-shirts and all kinds of other stuff. You can go to a hardware store and buy really cheap tools because all of this stuff is made abroad by people who are oppressed by this economic system. And a lot of people don't want to give up those benefits.
But wait a minute, though. Even those benefits come with a cost. Because I remember there's a documentary, and I recommend everybody watch it. It used to be on Netflix. It's called The High Cost of Low Price. And and there will be someone. There was always someone who will offer to do something for you for a price you wouldn't believe, but at a cost you couldn't have imagined. And I think cheap goods is a good example. Yeah. You buy cheap goods, but guess what? That now enables them to basically depress your wages. And you'll eventually end up in the point where cheap goods is all a wash.
And you can make that argument to people with manufacturing jobs. But the problem is that in Western societies, the percentage of people with manufacturing jobs is now very small. And because of that, many people don't really have any stake in the return of manufacturing jobs.
You're right. I can make that argument to people with manufacturing jobs, but I can also make that argument to people who work in those places because their wages are also depressed because of this. Because so many people are now no longer in the manufacturing sector, they're forced into the remaining sectors, which are the service sector and things of that nature. And their wages are also depressed just by simple laws of supply and demand.
Right. But see, now you've got a more complicated argument. Now you have to go a little bit further to explain it to people. And you still have people who are in sectors that they perceive to be doing rather well. You have people in the healthcare sector where wages have continually gone up. Across the economy, yes, wages are going down. Yes, our trade position with a lot of foreign states has a lot to do with that. But trade policy is a tough, complicated international issue. There are a lot of people who are going to say, well, if you're against that, then you're against trade in general. Which, of course, you're not. But they're going to make that argument to you. They're going to claim that if you don't want to trade with countries that have lower wages than Western countries, then you're against trade in general, and that means that you're against an obvious law of free market economics. They'll say this.
Well,
and
again,
economics illiterate.
I think we're going to go ahead.
And that's what they've essentially tried to do to people who make trade policy the central plank in their agenda. And you can get some distance with trade policy if you frame it correctly. But I think that the ability of people to there are so many goods right now that are created by people in low-wage countries that we consume, that it is a very tough issue to win on.
Okay, so again, now we're talking about trade, and we're kind of waffling around here, guys, and kind of using these issues as examples. But the point here is that the main point of contention is again, I believe that politicians, if properly suited and with the will to do so, can be both actors. It can be both actors and also be brought about by contextual conditions. Maybe the conditions produce them to be an actor. I'm not sure.
Then we moved on to this other argument, which was about whether the conditions existed. So there's that theoretical argument we had about agents and conditions. And then here we were talking about, do the conditions exist for anti-imperialism to become broadly popular? And here's an example that I think kind of points to our difficulty here. If we look at what's going on with Russia and Donald Trump and the way that many people are handling the Russians, the attitude is that the Russians are a nefarious agent that comes in and messes with our election and interferes with us.
That's the being framed, though.
the anti-imperialist story tends to put the United States in the position of power and in the potential oppressor's seat. And right now, the attitude in a lot of media is that the Russians are the ones who are getting involved in other people's business. And the Russians are the ones intervening in our politics and in other countries' politics. And people are going to be quite resistant, whether they should or shouldn't be, to the idea that those roles are flipped.
Okay.
Or that those roles are around.
So again, just because it's out there, and so in all of this argument that we've done, just in this 44 minutes, and we're almost out of time, by the way, we really haven't gotten anywhere, which is sad. But in all this time, like implicit in this is that, we're trying to talk about what people are talking about. And we have to understand that a lot of that is pushed by the media, and the media is in many respects in league with a lot of the forces that we're trying to move against. So the media is not going to do us any favors, but I think the faster we begin to challenge that and not kowtow to it, or don't even really, to be honest with you, the nature of the two-party system, you can literally just stand on the truth, even if it's unpopular, and just by nature of doing it for long enough, you can end up in a situation where political wins will come your way.
And that's where you get into trouble. If you don't have the material power to get control over the media, then you have to act politically in an environment in which that media is dominant. And you have to take into account the things that media, given its dominance, is likely to do. And so in that environment, unless you can change the distribution of ownership in the media, unless you can change the Google and Facebook, internet companies that regulate which content is going to be seen on social media, then you're left acting in a space you don't have control over. And so when we're acting in spaces we don't have control over, we have to be especially strategic in how we present our messages and what we choose to emphasize, that we don't come across as the kind of people that have to be boxed out of the conversation entirely.
So here's the problem. So I understand being able to anticipate the media, but I think, again, with media distrust being at an all-time low, even if they do dominate the conversation, you literally can stand on the truth and make a strong case for it, because at a certain point, the material conditions will push people to give you a chance, even if it doesn't sound right, even if it's crazy, even if it's not even coherent in many cases. You will get your opportunity and you have to run with it. But if you stand on the truth and be good on many issues, you can still make a lot of progress. And again, I'm leaning heavily here on the notion that just an idea, just being around long enough, will get credibility just for being there long enough and just being said enough and being heard enough by enough people. And I think Thomas Paine will attest to that.
I admire the optimism, but I think that a lot of people have managed to get further in the United States in the last year by standing on falsehood and by using the skepticism of the media to further much different agendas from the agendas we'd like to see.
And look, I won't deny that. I'm not saying that it's going to be easy. What I'm saying is
necessarily has an epistemic advantage in the debate. I don't have that level of confidence in the free and open deliberation. That I'm not having like an optimistic view. What I'm saying is that's what you have to contend with, but you can't succumb to that and say I'll have to work from within that frame, because that frame is unworkable. You have to try to go outside of that frame and just persevere on. If you can't change the frame, if you have a power problem, sometimes in the left we have a power problem. We don't have the power to do what we ideally would like to do. So when we're in that situation, we have to see, okay, what can we do with the power we do have? What opportunities are open? What are the things we can do? And I think that's very often much greater than what centrists would have us believe, but it's not everything.
And again, I still do believe, implicit in that is it almost seems as though, that statement, like we don't have the power to do this. It's like, no, you don't have it now, you'll have it soon. Like create situations to where you can, and eventually you will. Like there's no such thing as never having an opportunity to change something. Nothing is fixed where it just can't be changed.
But we're not the left-wingers who have walked the earth. There have been left-wing movements, and these things have been tried, and we've been through, and we've seen historically a lot of the same kinds of situations before, where because we have not been willing to acknowledge our constraints and acknowledge the environment that we're operating in, we've allocated our resources in ways that are less than fully efficient.
And again, I would say that, we've seen through history that acknowledging our strengths and feeling like we don't have the power to accomplish things and only accepting what we feel is feasible in the moment has often led to defeat as well. So the question is, where do you go?
Well, yeah, then that's the thing. It has to be something that we discuss. And so I agree with you that we shouldn't take the view that there's nothing we can do.
Well, even the view that there are some small things that we can do.
No matter what, that we can do everything. And so I'm saying it's got to be somewhere in between. This argument that we get into where it becomes dichotomized, and if you say that there's anything that we can't do, then you're an advocate for centrism, I think is too reductive. There is a space in between these two positions. This position of there's nothing we can do and we have to just vote for Hillary Clinton types, and the position of we can do everything, we can have a revolution next week. Somewhere in between is the truth of what's really possible in this historical moment and in these material conditions. And our goal should be to try to find that space rather than to valorize optimism for its own.
Okay. And, I think ultimately, I understand that you can't get everything that you want. I'm not saying it's either all or nothing approach, but what you don't want to do is empower what will you give into something now for the sake of getting something done today that ends up having a detrimental effect on you in the long run. And I think things like voting for the Hillary Clinton types, or even not being able to rein in Bernie Sanders on American imperialism is one of those things. It's good today. But if you aren't getting that message out there and beginning to push that agenda, if you're willing to sacrifice that to kind of just get these things through today and you give up on that, that comes back and bites you later on. And that's the problem.
I would agree, but then we have to find where the space is. And I think that there's a tendency to play pendulum on this, where if we feel that it's not right, we want to run all the way in the other direction. And of course, the elusive thing with the pendulum is getting it to stop swinging and find the spot where things are in equilibrium and where you can then move forward.
Well, what I was going to say, with so many moving parts, there's never any equilibrium. But we're actually out of time today. So I'm going to basically let Ben give out his closing thoughts here. And then I was going to say what was supposed to be the original intent of this video before we start to rehash what we talked about last time. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah. Well, I think that Corbyn has an opportunity going forward because the Conservative Party in Britain still really doesn't have a clear view of a Brexit which it can achieve. And because that dominates the foreign policy scene and the Conservative Party continues to be associated with austerity and with decline in the public services that is unacceptable to the British people, that puts it in a poor position politically going forward. At the same time, I think that if Corbyn moderated a little bit, not all the way, but a little bit on certain foreign policy issues, that would really help. I continue to see the British press score points by portraying him as a terrorist sympathizer, as anti-Britain, anti-Western. And those are things which he could not completely eliminate that narrative, but he could chip away at it in the way that Bernie Sanders did, and that would give him some political boost, which I think would be good and useful to the rest of the agenda.
Okay, and what I will say is Bernie Sanders is no Jeremy Corbyn on foreign policy issues. In fact, I can't really see where his left position really begins on foreign policy. Like, all he just said was he voted against the Iraq War, and that's not necessarily, a valid left stance on foreign policy in general. So I think the comparison is really rough.
A lot of money and a lot of lives if the left had taken that stance. Even just that.
I disagree there, but let me go ahead and leave us with a quote, basically from
opposing the Iraq War.
Well, what I'm saying is that's not where we are now. Like, that was back then, and like, he voted against it, but it didn't matter. It went through anyway. Like, he did the right thing in that one particular instance, but there's a lot more right things to do in order to really to hold a left position on that.
Isn't that significant? Isn't that a step in a direction we'd like to go in?
It is a correct vote on one particular issue, but it's just one issue of very, very many. And we've basically moved down the line over several years that kind of make it not really a strong enough standing position. But anyway, I've been trying to wrap up for a second here, Ben. I'm just going to leave it out with a quote. And this is from Antonin Antonio Gramsci, for excuse me for killing his name right there, but I'm a pessimist because of intelligence, but I'm an optimist because of will. That is like basically summing up the way I come at it from a political perspective. And I want to thank you guys for spending this time with us and wish everybody a good night.